Ethan sat at his desk late at night. The city was quiet, but he could hear faint sounds through the walls. His sketchpad lay open in front of him. He was drawing with a charcoal pencil, focused on his work. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise. It sounded like a cry. Ethan froze and looked up. He walked to the window and glanced outside. Across the alley, a light was on in a nearby building. He could see people moving inside. Ethan squinted. He saw two figures in the room. One person was struggling. The other was holding them tightly. Ethan's heart began to race. He knew something was wrong. The struggling person tried to break free, but the other held on. Ethan felt scared. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to shout, but no words came out. He stood still, watching in shock. Suddenly, the struggling person fell to the floor. They stopped moving. The attacker stood over them and looked around the room. Ethan panicked. He ducked quickly, hiding behind the wall. His hands shook as he grabbed his phone. He dialed 911. "Hello? I need help," he said. The operator's voice was calm. "What is the emergency?" they asked. Ethan stammered. I saw someone get attacked," he said. "Where did this happen?" the operator asked. Ethan peeked out the window again. The room was now dark. The blinds were closed. The attacker and victim were gone. Ethan's heart sank. "They were just there," he whispered. "I swear I saw them." "Sir, are you sure?" the operator asked. Ethan's hands trembled. "Yes, but now they're gone," he said. He felt helpless. He had seen something terrible, but now there was no proof. Trauma and silence. The next morning, Ethan woke up feeling strange. His body felt stiff, and his head was spinning. The events from the night before kept replaying in his mind. He remembered the crime, the struggling figure, and the attacker's shadowy presence. He shivered at the memory. He tried to speak to himself, but no sound came out. His lips moved, but there were no words. Ethan touched his throat. It didn't hurt. He tried again to speak, but nothing happened. His heart began to race. "What's wrong with me?" he thought. Ethan grabbed a glass of water and drank it quickly. He thought it might help, but it didn't. He stood in front of the mirror, opened his mouth, and tried to shout. Still, no sound. His hands shook as panic set in. He sat down at his desk and wrote on a piece of paper. "Why can't I talk?" The silence around him felt overwhelming. He scribbled more notes, trying to figure out what to do next. His mind was full of questions, but he had no answers. After pacing around the apartment, Ethan decided he needed help. He grabbed his notebook and headed to the nearby clinic. When he arrived, the receptionist greeted him with a warm smile. Ethan quickly wrote a note explaining his problem and handed it to her. She read it, her eyebrows furrowing in concern. "You can't speak at all?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "Please wait here," the receptionist said. Ethan sat in the waiting area, his hands clutching his notebook. He felt frustrated. He wanted to scream but couldn't. Every minute felt like an hour as he waited to be seen. Finally, a nurse called his name. and he followed her to the doctor's office. The doctor, a kind man with glasses, smiled as Ethan sat down. "What seems to be the problem?" the doctor asked. Ethan wrote down his response. "I can't speak. It started this morning." The doctor asked Ethan several questions. "Does your throat hurt? Did you injure it?" Ethan shook his head. He wrote, "No pain. It just stopped working." The doctor examined Ethan's throat and ears carefully. "Everything looks normal," the doctor said. "I don't see anything physically wrong." Ethan's shoulders sank. He felt hopeless. "Tell me," the doctor said, "have you been under a lot of stress lately? Did anything unusual happen?" Ethan froze. His mind flashed back to the crime he had seen. He nodded slowly and wrote, "I saw someone get attacked." The doctor leaned back in his chair. "This might be psychogenic aphonia," he said. "It's when your voice stops working because of psychological trauma. Your brain is blocking your ability to speak." Ethan frowned and wrote, "When will it come back?" The doctor sighed. "It's hard to say. It might return on its own, or you might need therapy and time to recover." Ethan left the clinic feeling empty. He had no voice and no way to tell anyone what he had seen. He wondered if anyone would believe him now. Communicating without words. Ethan sat at his desk again, staring at a blank sheet of paper. His notebook and pencil lay in front of him, but he didn't know where to start. He couldn't speak to explain what he had seen, but maybe he could draw it. His hands trembled as he picked up the pencil. He closed his eyes, trying to picture the scene from the night before. The room across the alley, the attacker, the victim. Every detail felt important. He began with the basics, sketching the outline of the room. He added the window, the shadows, and the two figures. Slowly, the image started to form. But something wasn't right. He couldn't remember the attacker's face clearly. It was all a blur. He rubbed his temples, frustrated. He erased part of the drawing and started over. Each time he drew the figure, the details seemed wrong. Was the attacker wearing a hoodie? Did they have long hair? His memory felt foggy, and the more he tried to focus, the more it slipped away. Ethan sighed and leaned back in his chair. He looked at the unfinished sketch. It wasn't enough. No one would understand what he had seen just by looking at this. He thought about adding more details but felt unsure. What if he got something wrong? What if people didn't believe him? Determined to try again, Ethan grabbed a new sheet of paper. He started over, working slower this time. He added the attacker's posture and the way they leaned over the victim. He remembered how the victim's hands had been raised, trying to defend themselves. He sketched these details carefully, hoping it would make the scene clearer. Hours passed as Ethan worked. His desk was covered with crumpled papers and half-finished sketches. He felt exhausted, but he couldn't stop. Each drawing brought him closer to the truth, but none of them felt complete. He stared out the window, looking at the building across the alley. The window where it all happened was now dark and lifeless. Ethan thought about going to the police with his sketches, but he hesitated. What if they dismissed him again? The first time, they hadn't believed him because there was no evidence. Would they believe him now? His voice was still gone, and his drawings felt like weak proof. He decided to keep trying. He started another sketch, focusing this time on the attacker's stance and the sharp angles of their shadow. The room's faint light and the victim's slumped figure began to take shape. This time, the image felt stronger. He stared at the finished drawing for a long time. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best he could do. Ethan placed the sketch on his desk and sighed. He knew he couldn't stay silent forever. If he wanted to stop the killer, he needed to find a way to make someone believe him. The next day, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the attacker was still nearby. He paced his apartment, glancing out the window at the alley below. Something about the building across from him seemed off. The blinds to the room where the crime had happened were still closed. There were no signs of life, no movement. Ethan decided to take a closer look. He grabbed his notebook and sketches, slipping them into his bag. With a deep breath, he headed down to the alley. The air was cold and damp, and the faint smell of garbage filled the narrow space. He scanned the ground carefully, searching for anything that could prove what he had seen. At first, he found nothing. Just old papers, a broken bottle, and a few empty cans. But then, something caught his eye near a stack of crates. A small object glinted in the weak sunlight. Ethan crouched down and picked it up. It was a glove, torn and stained with something dark. His stomach twisted. Was this connected to the crime? He couldn't be sure, but it felt important. Ethan slipped the glove into a plastic bag he had brought with him. He continued to search the area. A few feet away, he found another clue. A keychain with a strange symbol on it. It looked like it might belong to the victim, or even the attacker. His hands shook as he placed it into his bag. Just as he stood up, Ethan felt like someone was watching him. He turned quickly, but saw no one. The alley was empty. Still, the uneasy feeling stayed with him as he hurried back to his apartment. He locked the door behind him and sat down to examine what he had found. The glove and keychain seemed like solid evidence, but Ethan knew it wasn't enough. The police had already dismissed his earlier call. Would they believe him now? He decided to write a detailed note explaining everything. The crime he had seen, the room where it happened, and the items he had found. He carefully added his sketches and sealed everything in an envelope. Later that evening, Ethan walked to the local police station. He handed the envelope to the officer at the front desk. The officer glanced at it briefly and gave a small nod. "We'll take a look," he said in a bored tone. Ethan wanted to scream, to tell them how serious this was, but he couldn't. Instead, he left the station feeling frustrated. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with thoughts of the crime and the items he had found. Had the police even opened his envelope? Were they taking it seriously? Or would the clues be ignored like his phone call? As Ethan drifted into a restless sleep, he didn't notice the shadowy figure standing across the street, watching his apartment. Ethan woke up to an eerie silence in his apartment. the sunlight streaming through his window didn't ease the unsettling feeling that something was wrong. He glanced at his desk where he had left his sketches the night before. His heart sank. The top sketch, the one that most clearly resembled the attacker, was gone. He froze, staring at the empty space. He hadn't moved the sketch. He was sure of it. Ethan's pulse quickened. Someone had been in his apartment. His mind raced. Had he forgotten to lock the door? No, he had checked it twice before going to bed. Whoever had taken the sketch had found another way in. Ethan rushed to his door and checked the lock. It was still intact. He ran to the windows and inspected the latches. They were all closed, but something about them felt off. It was as if they had been opened and carefully closed again. Panic set in as he realized the intruder might still be nearby. Ethan grabbed his notebook and quickly scribbled, "Who took the sketch? How did they get in?" He looked around the room, searching for other signs of intrusion. On the coffee table, he found a small note written in messy handwriting. It read, "Stop looking, or you'll regret it." His hands shook as he read the message over and over. The killer knew he had seen something. They knew he was trying to prove what he had witnessed. Ethan crumpled the note and threw it into the trash, but the fear didn't go away. He felt like the walls of his apartment were closing in on him. Later that day, Ethan decided to take precautions. He installed extra locks on his doors and windows. He even placed a chair under the doorknob at night to make it harder for anyone to break in. But despite these efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few days, Ethan noticed strange things happening. Objects in his apartment were moved when he wasn't home. His sketch pad, which he always left on his desk, was once found on the couch. A drawer in the kitchen was left open, even though he hadn't used it. Each time, the unease grew stronger. One evening, Ethan caught a glimpse of movement outside his window. He peeked through the blinds and saw a shadowy figure standing on the sidewalk, staring up at his apartment. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, even when Ethan turned on the light. After a few minutes, the figure walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Ethan wrote a message in his notebook. "They're watching me. They're warning me." He knew the killer wasn't just trying to scare him. They were sending a message. Stop digging, or else. But Ethan couldn't stop. He had come too far. He needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. Cat and mouse Ethan's days blurred into a constant state of fear. Every noise outside his apartment made him jump. Every shadow in the corner of his eye felt like it was moving. He knew the killer was watching him, waiting for the right moment. He couldn't explain how he knew. It was a gut feeling that grew stronger with each passing hour. One night, Ethan decided to step outside. He hadn't left his apartment in days, afraid of what might happen. But staying inside wasn't helping either. He pulled on his hoodie, grabbed his bag with his notebook and sketches, and headed out into the cool night air. The streets were quieter than usual, with only the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Ethan walked quickly, his eyes darting around. He felt exposed, like someone was following him. He stopped to look behind him but saw nothing. The alley where the crime had occurred was just a block away. Against his better judgment, Ethan decided to walk past it. As he approached the alley, his pulse quickened. The dim light from a nearby street lamp cast long shadows on the ground. He glanced down the narrow path and froze. A figure stood at the far end, half hidden in the darkness. It was the same shadowy figure he had seen outside his apartment. They were just standing there, watching him. Ethan's breathing grew shallow. His legs felt heavy, but he forced himself to move. He turned quickly and walked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear footsteps behind him now, slow and deliberate. He didn't dare look back. He broke into a run, his feet pounding the pavement. The footsteps behind him quickened. Ethan darted around a corner, weaving through side streets until he reached his building. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and slamming it shut behind him. He pressed his back against the door, trying to catch his breath. But the danger didn't end there. Over the next few days, the stalking escalated. Ethan received more messages, each one more threatening than the last. One note read, "We're closer than you think." Another simply said, "Time is running out." Ethan knew the killer wasn't just scaring him anymore. They were planning something. One evening, as Ethan sat at his desk trying to work on a new sketch, his phone buzzed. He rarely used his phone, but this message made his blood run cold. It was a photo of his apartment door taken from the hallway. The caption read, "Knock, knock." Ethan grabbed his phone and ran to the door. He looked through the peephole but saw nothing. He stood there for several minutes, his heart racing, before slowly backing away. His hands shook as he wrote in his notebook, "They're here. They're watching me." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, every creak of the floorboards like a warning. Around midnight, he heard footsteps outside his door. He sat up, his breath caught in his throat. The steps stopped, and a light tap came at the door. Then silence. Ethan didn't dare move. He sat frozen on his bed, clutching his notebook. Minutes passed, then hours. When the morning light finally crept into the room, Ethan walked cautiously to the door. He opened it slowly and found a new note taped to the outside. It read, "You can't hide forever." Ethan knew he was running out of time. The killer wasn't going to stop. He had to act fast, but he couldn't do it alone. Ethan knew he needed help. The killer's threats were becoming more frequent, and he couldn't face this alone anymore. But who could he trust? The police had ignored him before, and he didn't have many close friends. He sat at his desk, staring at his notebook, feeling hopeless. Then he remembered someone, Maya, a journalist he had met at a local gallery months ago. She had interviewed him about his art. Maya was smart, curious, and always looking for a good story. If anyone could help him, it was her. Ethan grabbed his phone and typed a message to Maya. "I need your help. It's urgent." He attached a photo of one of his sketches of the crime scene and hit send. Within minutes, his phone buzzed with a reply. "What's going on?" "Meet me at the cafe on 5th Street in an hour." Ethan felt a flicker of hope. He packed his sketches and notes into his bag and left his apartment, glancing nervously down the hall before stepping outside. The cafe was only a few blocks away, but every step felt heavy. He constantly looked over his shoulder, half expecting to see the killer following him. When he arrived, Maya was already waiting at a corner table. She looked concerned as she waved him over. "Ethan, what's going on?" she asked as he sat down. Ethan pulled out his notebook and began writing furiously. He passed her the note. "I saw a crime. I can't speak. Someone is after me." Maya read the note, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "You witnessed a crime? What kind of crime?" she asked. Ethan handed her one of his sketches, the one showing the attacker leaning over the victim. Maya stared at it for a long moment. "This is serious," she said. "Have you gone to the police?" Ethan nodded and wrote, "They didn't believe me. No evidence." He then added, "Someone broke into my apartment. They took one of my sketches." Maya's eyes widened. "You're saying the killer knows you saw them?" Ethan nodded again. Maya sat back in her chair, deep in thought. "We need to be smart about this," she said. "If the police won't help, we'll have to gather proof ourselves." Over the next few hours, Ethan and Maya came up with a plan. Maya would use her journalism skills to dig into the history of the apartment building and find out who might have a motive. Ethan would work on creating a perfect sketch of the killer's face. They decided to meet again the next day to share their findings. As Ethan left the cafe, he felt a little less alone. Maya believed him, and she was willing to help. But he also knew this was just the beginning. The killer was still out there, and time was running out. The next morning, Ethan met Maya at her small office downtown. She had spent the entire night researching, and the desk in front of her was covered with papers, photos, and notes. "I found something," she said as Ethan sat down. Maya pointed to an old photo of a man in his early 30s. "This is Lucas Hale. He's been living in the apartment across from yours for about a year. But here's the interesting part. He's changed his name multiple times in the past decade. Every time, it's linked to a suspicious disappearance or incident. He might be your guy." Ethan stared at the photo, his hands tightening around his notebook. He wrote quickly, "Can we prove it?" Maya frowned. "Not yet. We need something solid. The police won't act on suspicion alone, and they've already dismissed you once. But what if we lure him out? If he thinks you have evidence, he might slip up." Ethan hesitated, but he nodded. He wrote, "What's the plan?" "We'll set a trap," Maya said. "You'll act like you've uncovered new evidence and plan to hand it over to the police. I'll follow you and capture everything on camera. If Lucas comes after you, we'll have proof." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The idea of confronting the killer terrified him, but he knew this might be his only chance to stop him. He wrote, "Let's do it." That evening, Ethan began putting the plan into action. He taped copies of his sketches to the walls of his apartment, making it look like he had been piecing together a larger story. He even left a fake letter on his desk, addressed to the police, detailing the evidence he had collected. Maya set up hidden cameras in his apartment to catch Lucas if he tried to break in again. Then they waited. Hours passed, and the apartment was eerily quiet. Ethan sat on the couch, pretending to read through his notes. His heart pounded with every creak of the building. He glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. Just as he was starting to think the plan wouldn't work, there was a faint noise at the door. Ethan froze. Someone was trying to pick the lock. He grabbed his phone and quickly texted Maya, who was stationed in her car outside. "He's here." The lock clicked, and the door slowly opened. Lucas stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Ethan's blood ran cold as he watched the man move toward the desk, his expression dark and determined. Lucas picked up one of the fake letters and read it, his face twisting in anger. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Lucas muttered under his breath. He started searching through the papers on the desk, clearly looking for something. Ethan's phone buzzed. Maya had texted back, "Stay hidden. I'm coming." But before she could arrive, Lucas turned toward the couch. He had noticed something, a small movement or sound Ethan had accidentally made. Their eyes met, and Lucas's expression shifted to one of cold fury. "You shouldn't have done this," he said. Ethan bolted. He ran toward the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. Lucas pounded on the door, shouting threats. Ethan grabbed his notebook and scribbled, "Maya, hurry!" He slipped the note under the door just as Lucas began kicking it. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the living room. Maya had burst in, holding her camera and shouting, "I've called the police! They're on their way!" Lucas froze for a moment, then turned and fled. Maya chased after him, her camera still rolling. Ethan stumbled out of the bedroom, his legs shaking. He could hear Maya yelling outside, followed by the sound of sirens in the distance. The final showdown. Ethan stood in the middle of his apartment, trembling. Maya returned moments later, panting from the chase. "He's fast," she said, locking the door behind her. "But I got some of it on camera." Before they could catch their breath, they heard loud footsteps in the hallway. Lucas was back, angrier than ever. "We need to get out of here," Maya whispered. But before they could move, the door burst open. Lucas stood there, his face twisted with rage. He held a crowbar in one hand, glaring at Ethan and Maya. "You shouldn't have messed with me," he growled. Ethan grabbed his sketch pad and threw it at Lucas, distracting him for a split second. "Run!" Maya screamed. Ethan bolted toward the fire escape, Maya right behind him. They climbed out the window, the metal staircase rattling beneath their feet. Lucas was close behind them. Ethan's heart pounded as he climbed higher and higher, each step feeling heavier. The cold night air stung his face, and his legs burned with effort. He glanced down and saw Lucas gaining on them, his footsteps echoing in the narrow alley below. "Keep going," Maya urged. They reached the rooftop where the city stretched out beneath them in a sea of lights. There was nowhere left to run. Ethan looked around desperately for something, anything, they could use to defend themselves. Lucas climbed onto the rooftop, his breath heavy but steady. He looked at them with a twisted smirk. "You've made a big mistake," he said, advancing slowly. "No one's going to save you now." Maya held up her phone, still recording. "The police are on their way," she said, her voice firm despite her shaking hands. "They've seen your face." Lucas laughed, shaking his head. "Do you think that matters? By the time they get here, it'll be too late." Ethan glanced around the rooftop and spotted a stack of paint cans left by maintenance workers. Without hesitation, he grabbed one and hurled it at Lucas. The can missed but hit the ground with a loud clang, splattering paint everywhere. Lucas lunged toward Ethan, swinging the crowbar. Ethan dodged, barely avoiding the blow. He stumbled but quickly regained his footing. Maya tried to intervene, throwing a small wrench she found near the rooftop's edge, but it only grazed Lucas's shoulder. He turned his attention to her, his expression darkening. Seeing his chance, Ethan grabbed another can of paint and threw it directly at Lucas's face. This time, it hit its mark. Bright red paint covered Lucas's eyes, blinding him. He roared in frustration, swinging the crowbar wildly. Ethan and Maya backed away, trying to stay out of reach. Lucas wiped the paint from his face, his movements frantic. "You think this will stop me?" he snarled. He charged toward Ethan, but his footing slipped on the wet paint. He stumbled, his arms flailing as he tried to regain balance. Ethan saw the opportunity and pushed a heavy tool chest toward Lucas. It collided with him, knocking him off balance completely. Lucas fell backward, landing hard on the rooftop. The crowbar slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground. Police sirens blared in the distance, growing louder. Maya stepped forward, her phone still recording. "It's over," she said, her voice steady. Lucas tried to get up, but Ethan grabbed the crowbar and pointed it at him, shaking his head. Lucas glared at them, breathing heavily. "This isn't over," he hissed. But before he could do anything else, the door to the rooftop burst open, and police officers swarmed in, weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them!" one of the officers shouted. Lucas froze, realizing he had no way out. Slowly, he raised his hands, his face contorted with anger. The officers moved in and handcuffed him, dragging him away. Ethan collapsed onto the rooftop, his body trembling with relief. Maya knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said softly. "It's over." As the police took Lucas into custody, Ethan and Maya were escorted back to Ethan's apartment. The officers asked them to recount everything. Maya took the lead, explaining their plan to lure Lucas into the trap. She showed them the video recordings from her phone, which clearly captured Lucas breaking into the apartment and threatening Ethan. The lead officer nodded as he reviewed the footage. "This is solid evidence," he said. "We've been tracking Lucas for a while, but we didn't have enough to bring him in. You've both done something incredibly brave." Ethan felt a wave of relief, but also exhaustion. He sat at the table, his hands still trembling. One of the officers handed him a notebook and a pen. "If you can't speak, write down anything else you remember," they said. Ethan nodded and began writing. He detailed the events of the night he witnessed the crime, describing the victim, the struggle, and every detail he could recall about Lucas. He included his sketches, carefully labeling each one with notes about what he had seen. As Ethan worked, Maya continued talking to the officers. "He was planning to harm Ethan," she said firmly. "He left threatening notes and even broke into his apartment multiple times. This wasn't just about covering his tracks. He was targeting him." The officers exchanged glances, and one of them said, "We'll ensure Lucas doesn't get out on bail. He's dangerous, and you've both given us enough to keep him behind bars." Ethan finished writing and handed the notebook to the officer. The man skimmed through it and nodded. "This is good work," he said. "You've helped us take a dangerous person off the streets." As the officers packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Maya turned to Ethan. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Ethan gave a small nod, but his eyes showed the weight of everything he had been through. Just as the police were about to leave, one of them paused and turned back. "By the way," the officer said, "we found a keychain with a strange symbol in Lucas's pocket. Does it mean anything to you?" Ethan's eyes widened. He quickly grabbed a piece of paper and drew the same symbol he had found on the keychain in the alley. The officer nodded. "This connects Lucas to the crime scene," he said. "It's more evidence to lock him away." As the officers left, Maya sat beside Ethan. "You did it," she said with a smile. "You found a way to tell your story, even without words." Ethan felt tears well up in his eyes. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of safety and closure. A week had passed since Lucas was arrested. Ethan still felt the weight of what had happened, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The constant fear that had taken over his life was finally gone. He no longer felt the killer's shadow lurking around every corner. Ethan decided it was time to get back to his art. His apartment was still messy from the chaos, with sketches scattered everywhere and notebooks filled with notes about the crime. He carefully gathered the papers and placed them into a folder. These sketches, which once symbolized his fear, now felt like a victory. They were proof that he had overcome something unimaginable. He sat at his desk, staring at a blank canvas. At first, his hand hesitated. The memories of that terrible night still lingered. But slowly, he began to draw. His lines were soft, deliberate, and full of emotion. This time, his art wasn't about fear. It was about strength, survival, and finding his voice again. A few days later, Ethan received a call from Maya. "Hey, how are you holding up?" she asked. Ethan still couldn't speak, but he texted back, "Better. Thank you for everything." Maya replied with a smiling emoji. "I've got some news," she said. "The gallery is interested in your story. They want to showcase your sketches as part of a special exhibit." Ethan felt a mix of emotions. The idea of sharing such a personal and traumatic experience was daunting, but he also knew it could help others. He texted Maya, "Let's do it." The gallery event was held a month later. People from the community came to see the exhibit, which included Ethan's sketches, Maya's recordings, and a timeline of the events. Ethan stood quietly in the corner, watching as people viewed his work. Many approached him, expressing their admiration for his bravery. For Ethan, the exhibit wasn't just about art. It was a way to heal, to turn his pain into something meaningful. He realized that even without his voice, he could still tell his story, and in doing so, he could inspire others to find strength in their silence. A few weeks after the gallery exhibit, Ethan was invited to speak at a community event. It was a gathering focused on courage and overcoming adversity. Ethan felt nervous. He still hadn't regained his voice, but he wanted to share his story. Maya stood beside him on the stage. She introduced him to the audience. "Ethan is an artist who faced something unimaginable," she said. "Tonight, he wants to share his journey with all of you." Ethan stepped forward, holding a stack of cards. Each card had words written in large, clear letters. He began showing them to the audience one by one. The first card read, "Thank you for being here." The second card said, "I lost my voice, but I found new ways to speak." He continued, revealing each message slowly. "Fear tried to silence me, but I learned that silence can be powerful. We all face challenges that make us feel helpless, but we can find strength in unexpected places. I used my art to tell my story. You have your own ways to express yourself. Don't let fear stop you from being heard. Even when words fail, your actions matter." The audience watched intently. The room was silent, but the impact of his words was strong. Ethan held up the next card. "Thank you for listening to my silent voice." He took a deep breath and showed the final card. "Together we can overcome anything." The audience erupted into applause. Some people stood up, clapping and cheering. Ethan felt a warmth spread through him. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. After the event, many people approached Ethan to thank him. They shared their own stories of struggle and how his message inspired them. One young woman said, "You showed me that I don't need to shout to be heard." Maya looked at Ethan with pride. "You did great," she said. "Your message touched a lot of hearts tonight." Ethan wrote in his notebook, "I couldn't have done it without you." Maya smiled. "Maybe not," she said, "but the strength was always inside you." As they left the event, Ethan felt a sense of closure. He knew his voice might return someday, but even if it didn't, he had found other ways to communicate. He had turned his silence into a source of strength, not weakness. Ethan looked up at the night sky, the stars shining brightly. He felt hopeful for the future. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew he could face them.